Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Indianaut podcast, where we interview some of India's next best analytical and creative minds who are not only revolutionizing their own field, but at the same time transforming India's entrepreneurial ecosystem one step at a time.
Our guest for the day is the founding partner of India Internet Fund. Founded in 2011 as one of the first few venture capital funds, IIF focuses on early stage technology investments. Previously, he has worked with McKinsey Co, Goldman Sachs, and the Government of India. He is a graduate of Harvard University and the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. In addition to all of this, our guest is the author of the recently published book, The Great Tech Game. His book focuses on how technology is not only shaping our daily lives, but the fate of nations as well.
We have with us Anirudh Suri. Let us jump right into the conversation. Hi, Anirudh. I hope you're all settled in.
I'm great. No, thanks for having me on the show, Gautam.
Thank you so much for being here. Okay, so let us jump into the conversation, Anirudh. You have had a fascinating career, ranging from working with large corporations such as Goldman Sachs and McKinsey to founding the India Internet Fund. With each of these experiences, sort of playing into how, your worldview is that technology is shaping up to be a critical factor, not just at a micro level, but at a macro level as well. So in your own words, as the co-founder of IIF, tell us your Indianaut origin story.
Sure. So I think, as Gautam, you very kindly pointed out, I've had the privilege, I would really say, of being able to work in very different contexts, right? So I've spent some time working, as you mentioned, at firms like McKinsey. I've spent a little bit of time working with think tanks in Washington, D.C., working on foreign policy issues, a brief stint with the Indian government in the IT ministry, what is now called MeitY. And of course, for the last decade or so, I've been working in the tech VC and startup world through India Internet Fund and some startups that we'd incubated. So I've had the opportunity to work in different contexts and in different countries. Right, my stints at McKinsey and Goldman were in London and New York, respectively, so on and so forth. So I think the vantage point that's afforded me is that I've looked and seen very closely how technology is shaping different sectors very differently as well. Right. So when I spent time at McKinsey, for example, I was working with many companies in the US that were at that point. This is now I'm talking about the 2007-8 timeframe. They were starting to get threatened by or disrupted by emerging tech startups of the time, right? Whether it was in the retail sector or in the books sector, etc. The juggernaut of technology from a business standpoint was trying to disrupt established industries, right? That's something I saw very closely. When I worked in the Indian government, of course, in the IT ministry, there it was a very different vantage point. We were working on schemes that were trying to ensure that the internet penetration increased in the country, internet access increased in the country. And through various schemes that the government had put out, we were seeing how very challenging that still was from an infrastructure standpoint, from a policy standpoint, but at the same time, how important it was to make sure that internet access and penetration actually went deeper than just the cities, right? Because it was really shaping new opportunities for people who had access to the internet. And at the same time, it was denying those opportunities to those who didn't have access, right? And now for the last decade at IIF and through startups I've been engaged with, I've seen very closely how much of an engine of growth technology can be, right? For a country like India, I think it's quite obvious now over the last decade that tech, and as I argue in my book as well, that tech is really the new engine of economic growth. It's really the new wealth of nations, right? So my entire, I would say the last decade and a half has given me very different vantage points on how tech is shaping our world and how it will probably continue to. At the same time, what challenges we are likely to continue facing. It's not going to be a smooth ride for everyone necessarily.
Definitely, Anirudh. So let's actually, jump to the topic of the day now. That is your book, The Great Tech Game. Okay, which is absolutely incredible, by the way. So your book, The Great Tech Game, talks about how, technology is not just deeply interconnected with the global economy, but how geopolitics as well. And as you mentioned in your book that, planet Earth has gone through different geopolitical periods such as Pax Romana, Pax Islamica, Pax Mongolica, Pax Britannica, and Pax Americana. And now you mention that the current period we are in is that we are now living through a period known as Pax Technologica. So for our viewers and listeners, what is Pax Technologica and what is, the great tech game?
Sure, sure. No, thank you for asking that question. Let me lay out at least the concept behind the Great Tech Game and Pax Technologica for all of us. As you rightly pointed out, Gautam, we've lived through, at least humanity has, of course, planet Earth is much, much older than us, but
Yes.
humanity, we've gone through different eras that can be broadly classified into the ones that you mentioned, right? In fact, in the book, I go even further behind Pax Romana, where I talk about the great agri game, the great trading game. And it's really during the great trading game that I would say Pax Romana started. But the great agri game was the first great game, as I conceive it, in our human history that at least we know about a fair bit, which started over 10,000 years ago, where society went through a massive shift because of the introduction of agriculture. And many folks like Yuval Harari and others have written about this, so I'm definitely not the first to talk about this. But my argument is that every time there's this new era, most of us tend to see it from an economic standpoint, that the economics changed, right? In that era, the economic productive activity or the nature of economic activity changed. And while that's true, my argument in the book is that with each of these great games in history, in our human history, great agri game, the great trading game, the great industrialization and colonization game, and more recently the great even great capitalism game, I argue that with each of these great games you have a massive shift in not just economic activity but also geopolitical power, right? The center of geopolitical power will shift often. You'll have new winners and losers emerge in each of these eras or great games. And also, each of these great games build on the previous one. So you don't necessarily replace completely the previous game, but the new game, in a way, gets added on top as a layer. And whichever nations, regions, people have understood these games well in the past and have understood that the game has changed and start to play and build capabilities for the new game, have typically ended up being winners in the new game, right? Whereas the winners in the previous game, if they don't understand that transition or are willing to make that transition, they often end up being losers in the new game, even though they were winners in the previous one, right? And so I argue that today the game has even changed from the great capitalism game, of which, of course, the US and countries like that were the winners. Prior to that, the great industrialization, colonization game, clearly the winners were Western European nations that were the colonial and industrial powers of the time, right? And I argue that even though India has lost some of these more recent great games, we must keep a very close eye on what the great tech game is shaping up to be, and switch to playing the great tech game and not continue focusing only on the previous great games, right?
Understood.
So that's the great tech game. And I'll make a quick point about Pax Technologica versus Pax Americana. Pax Britannia, Pax Romana, Pax Mongolica, Pax Americana, all of these terms are now Pax Technologica, actually don't just mean the fact that there's this era that, for example, America is dominant in. So Pax Americana actually means the period of time during which America, for example, was the dominant power or is the dominant power, but is also, as a result, ensuring that there is a relatively peaceful period prevailing in the world.
Understood.
During which economic development can happen, during which trade can happen, and so on and so forth. So it actually refers to the peaceful time during such a great game, that allows other nations or other regions also to develop rapidly.
Quick question over here. So while there is one dominant, say, establishment, say Pax Americana, that would be America and America's allies. But I think during all of these periods, whether it was Pax Romana or Pax Mongolica or Pax Britannica or even Pax Americana, there would also be some losers. If say Americana was the peak, There would also be, for example, during the Britannica period, say the Western countries, the Western European countries were say at their peak, but at the same time, the Asian countries, or say, the African countries which were actually colonized, they were at the lowest. And I think similarly, each period has had extreme winners and losers per se.
No, absolutely, absolutely, Gautam. That's exactly right. That typically, when there are winners, obviously on the other side there are the
Right.
losers, right? During the colonial era, as you rightly mentioned, during Pax Britannica, of course, countries that were colonized in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America were the clear losers at that time, because not because they might not have grown, but because relative to the winners of that time, they were growing much slowly and much more slowly, and also they weren't necessarily uh, being able to take advantage of their own productive activities, right? A lot of our, in the case of India, I think we all know that a lot of the economic gains of whatever productive activities that India was engaged in, or Indians were engaged in during the colonial era, the gains did not accrue to us,
Right.
right? The
Right.
gains accrued to the winners of the time. Hence, they were
Right.
the winners.
Right. Right.
No, you're absolutely right that there are always losers associated with that period as well.
Right.
And that's my point. In fact, the tech game will similarly have a set of winners and losers, and you
Right.
don't uh, want to be on the losing side, because the stake of the livelihoods and the well-being and the prospects of a billion and over a billion people now are at stake. At least from the Indian context. But if you think about it from a stage, obviously even bigger stakes are at play.
Definitely, definitely. So you were talking about Pax Technologica. Let's continue that thought.
Yeah, so the only point I was making there was that the peaceful period that technology has now ruled in a way, or has been shaping our world for the last few decades, also seems to be coming to an end. The peaceful period,
Okay.
right? We are seeing a lot more now conflict
Okay.
over technological competition playing out in the world, right? So the last 20, 30 years have seen almost a rise of the internet, in a way that internet markets have developed in many different markets globally, right? The American startup ecosystem, the Chinese startup ecosystem, the European one, the Indian one, the Southeast Asian one, right? And you have early signs in Africa and Latin America as well of startup ecosystems starting to come up in those regions as well. But this has largely been while the internet battles have not been massive or dominant. But now internet and tech-driven battles are coming to a point where we might be reaching an era where tech, unfortunately or counterintuitively, also causes battles and also breaks the relative peace that prevailed in the world for the last 2, 3, 4 decades, right? You're finding that the US and China are now at loggerheads. Both these countries are trying to be the digital superpower of the world, right? And for China, it's very clearly a way to leapfrog against the US, or sort of ahead of the US. The US understands that if the China tech story becomes bigger, stronger, more dynamic than the US tech story, then that'll have ramifications for the rest of the US economy, US military power, US geopolitical power. And hence now the US and China seem to be engaged in a very, I would say, very consequential technological competition, right? That'll have
Right.
ramifications for the rest of the world as well. And I think that's something that we have to have our eye on now, whether we're in the startup world or not. You found that in the last few years, this US-China battle has had ramifications in the Indian startup ecosystem as well. India has banned several Chinese apps when it came to 5G infrastructure, like the US and some other countries. We have also, as a country, said that we don't want to be reliant on Chinese manufacturing companies when it comes to 5G infrastructure, which is obviously the next wave of tech infrastructure that will get built in India. And so we are finding, and that has ramifications for startups as well, right? Very clearly. Some startups have benefited from the fact that their Chinese competitors or equivalents have now not gotten access to the Indian market. So it has benefited some, but at the same time, we've also, I would say, on the other side, lost out on a couple of things. One is obviously capital that was coming in from China and Chinese big tech firms into Indian companies. Many prominent Indian startups, without naming them necessarily, obviously had Chinese investors that were the major investors in those companies, right?
Right.
So they've lost access to capital in a way, further capital. And then the other, I think, loss that has happened as a result is that the two startup ecosystems were really starting to interact a lot more.
Right.
Back in 2015-16, I remember very clearly that suddenly the Indian startup founders and even Indian venture capitalists were now no longer looking just to the West, right, for collaboration, for cross-pollination of ideas, um, and so on and so forth. The focus had also shifted east, right? So a lot of Indian startup founders, a lot of Indian venture capitalists were going to China, spending time there, understanding their business models, and so on and so forth, and vice versa, right? And I think that piece also we've sort of lost out on in a way because of these geopolitical and tech battles that threaten to
Right.
mark the end of technological, the peaceful period at least.
Right. I think you very rightly mentioned about how I think in today's day and age, it would actually be not be considered an accomplishment or not even validation, but would be considered a negative point if, say, an Indian startup was closely associating with a Chinese counterpart. I don't think it would be seen as a positive in today's day and age because of today's geopolitical climate. And I think that also hinders the Indian startup ecosystem because we are essentially cutting off access to capital from, say, a very economically powerful region of the world. But at the same time, given the current geopolitical circumstances, you also I think the nation state does not want to does not want Indian startups to actually have that kind of control or say owe that kind of favor to those to that part of the world. And I think that
That's
closely interlinks to the the tech and the society perspective of both the things.
that's right.
Yeah. Let me move to my next question now. So I'm not sure if this is the right example, but while I was reading your book, a prominent example of the themes that you talk about, I felt could also be seen in the current semiconductor market of the world, right? And how nations are competing against each other to maintain dominance in the semiconductor space. From China trying to control the raw materials itself, I think the rare earth materials that go into semiconductor manufacturing, to Taiwan being a big player in it, and how China and Taiwan do not see eye to eye on a lot many things, as well as US's technological expertise and competitive advantage in the manufacturing with the capitalist private industry setup over there. And so what is your view on this example, and how do you think this showcases Pax Technologica? I have another example in mind. I'll come to that next, but I want to ask you, I want to pick your brain on this one first.
Yeah, no, so in many ways, I think, Gautam, what's happening is that the nature of the economic engine of the world is changing,
Right.
right? It is no longer the conversations as far as raw materials is no longer contained to, let's say, oil, right? The geopolitics of our world is now shifting to materials that are very core to tech, right, and the tech world, right, or what I call the great tech game. And semiconductors, as you rightly mentioned, are a key component of it, right? I think now over the last year or two, many of us now understand this. Of course, this conversation has been going on for over a decade, I would say, almost in the geopolitical circles and in the tech manufacturing circles, that semiconductors today are at the core of not just, by the way, electronics, right? And these rare earths are not just at the core of just electronic devices like our phones and laptops, but also very importantly, they're at the core of even solar cells,
Right.
right? And as I think, as many of us know, there's a transition underway. I think we can maybe not agree. Many of us might not agree on the pace at which that transition is happening on the energy side, but there's a clear transition away from fossil fuels and oil-driven economy, right? And so it's clear that in the future, renewable energy, and of that renewable energy, solar energy will clearly be a big chunk. It's going to be a big driver of economic activity, right? So your industry will be powered by it, your homes will be powered by it. In fact, your EVs would be powered by it, right? And so any component like semiconductors that's going into such a core part of your economy obviously then has geopolitical implications, right? I'll give you a clear example from history as well. So when the British were also very clear when during the colonial era, during the British Pax Britannica, as we talk about, they were very clear on certain raw materials that they needed access to that they were going to deny. Right? We have all, I think, heard stories about how tea, their
Right.
consumption of tea, ended up causing them to go to war with China,
Right.
ended up causing them to grow tea in India, right? Because their dependence on tea was becoming a geopolitical weakness for them vis-a-vis China at the time, for example. In many ways today, lithium or rare materials like lithium, raw materials like lithium are now at the core of many battles. You'll be surprised, even I was surprised, by the way, Gautam, I didn't realize until recently that even in Ukraine, by the way, Ukraine has a
Okay.
big, one of the biggest reserves of lithium.
Oh.
And while in the Russia-Ukraine crisis, we've been talking about various other motivations, right, behind the recent crisis. Not many have spoken about the fact that Ukraine actually is one of the biggest reserves of lithium as well,
All
not just
right.
of edible
Okay.
oil and other, I think, things that we're talking about. So I think that these raw materials, these rare earth materials are now increasingly causing geopolitical battles, right? You mentioned China, Taiwan, that's exactly right. People say that even with the China-Taiwan crisis, there's one dimension which is historical, that China wants Taiwan to be reintegrated into Chinese mainland. But of course, there's also now another component, which is that Taiwan also happens to be one of the largest semiconductor manufacturing countries in the world. Right? TSMC is
Yes.
probably as valuable, if not valuable, than I would say Standard Oil in its day, or the East Indian Company. Right? So,
Right.
so massive implications. But it also, by the way, on the flip side, it's also leading to interesting friendships. So there's not just the negative ramifications. There's also positive ones in a way where India, Australia, for example, I've written about this recently also in an op-ed that India and Australia are coming together and getting closer recently in recent years. And one of the reasons is after China, the second largest reserves of rare earth material is in Australia. So if India wants to become a semiconductor player, which India is now trying to build fabs in India and have a slightly more, I would say, resilient supply chain for semiconductors, then new friendships start to happen, right? Like the ones with India and Australia. So I wrote an op-ed
Right.
about, or it's interesting that India and Australia are now transitioning from being cricket rivals to actually now being natural partners on the global scale. It's an interesting
Understood.
transition caused by, for example, semiconductors, partly at
Uh,
least.
another similar example that comes to mind is actually the space race that took place in the past century, essentially, which was in parallel to the Cold War between US and Russia. And now in today's day and age, the new space race would actually be between private big tech companies, that is Elon Musk and SpaceX, or Jeff Bezos and Blue Origin. And what is your view on this, on this entire paradigm shift that is taken from two states competing to now, say for example, say two private players competing?
I think the space piece is a very interesting domain where now, as you rightly said, Gautam, in the 60s, when the space race and the Cold War were at their peak between the US and the then USSR, those two nations at that point decided that we will not colonize space. We will not, no nation will ever be able to stake claim to any parts of, let's say, the moon or Mars, or any part of the space beyond planet Earth. What's interesting now, I think, Gautam, is there are a lot of signs emanating from various countries, whether it's the US, whether it's China, whether it's others, that this space race now, unfortunately, might no longer observe that agreement of the
Okay.
past. And there are increasingly signs that suggest that governments in several nations are letting private players now explore space and build at least space stations or base stations on the moon, etc., as a launching pad to even get to Mars,
Right.
right? And what we are finding is that there's most likely going to be, at some point or the other, now conflict over who builds a base station on what part of the moon, right?
All
On which
right.
side of the moon. Because there are certain favorable sides of the moon, there are certain favorable parts of the moon that lend themselves better as a launch pad for further space exploration, right?
Right.
So I think it's might be unfortunate. I think I hope that it doesn't come to that, but I think that a space war is now starting to become more likely, possibly, than it was in the 60s, 70s, where it seems like there was at least agreement that, as nations, we will not colonize space. But now, with the entry of the private players who are largely driven by commercial considerations, for them now extracting whether it's very valuable materials that are now available in space, right? For them to extract that, bring that back, or use parts of the moon to further do space explorations onto, let's say, to Mars, etc. These will largely become commercial considerations, and we know that in the past also, Gautam, I talk about this in the book. The East India Company came to India not as a geopolitical player, but as a trading player, as a
Right.
commercial player. Pulled into geopolitics, they were pulled into military conflict because they had to protect their economic commercial interests in it, right?
Right.
Um, and and so I worry that today we might end up in a similar situation where we might be doing these explorations from a relatively benign commercial standpoint, but when
Right.
it's a big, any realist person will know that geopolitical conflict, military conflict, and other conflicts then emerge, right? So I
Right.
worry that the space dimension will become a source of big conflict again between the major powers.
Understood. Right. 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 No, that makes perfect sense. How commercial considerations are followed by geopolitical conflicts or arms conflicts or or tensions that were initially not expected to be there. And I think all colonized nations are a good example of that. But yes.
That's right. And one of the things that I talk about in the book also is this idea of digital colonialism, right?
Right.
Where there are fears today, at least among certain quarters, especially in the developing world, countries like you're rightly saying that were colonized in the past, right? Because you'll know that even in India, many things are perceived from a perspective that we don't want to be colonized again. That was a terrible 200, 250 years of our history.
Understood.
We
Right.
don't want that to repeat. So a lot of our resistance towards foreign companies, foreign powers, is often from the mindset or the perspective that we don't want that part of our history to repeat. Right? So we are,
Understood.
at least our views are colored or shaped by that. And and I think now there are some concerns that when it comes to our data, when it comes to our markets, we don't want those to be dominated by foreign powers in a way that prevents the benefits of that economic activity driven by data or driven by tech markets
Right.
to not accrue back to the people who are generating
Right.
those
Right.
resources in the first place. And
And
I think that's a reasonable concern, but that has to be balanced. In India and in other colonized nations, sometimes anti-colonial um, agendas or anti-colonial arguments often become emotional ones, right? And
right.
rightly
Right.
so, because those were terrible times. But they should not, in my view, be used as an excuse or as a way to completely disconnect our countries from the rest of the world, right?
Understood.
The
Right.
response is a disconnect to save ourselves from potential
Right.
dominance or something. The response has to be, how do we make sure that we don't repeat the mistakes we made in the past and make sure we are able to engage with the rest of the world on an equal footing, right? And so whatever we
Right.
need to do that, that's what we need to be doing, not that we will become protectionist or that we will close ourselves off, because then actually we just end up losing the game altogether because we're not playing the game. Then we're living in our own bubbles, and that's
Right.
also not a good response.
Definitely. Definitely. Let us move forward to another section of your book. So I believe there's a section in the book that is setting the rules of the great tech game, and there is a chapter over there where you focus on how nation states are competing with big tech companies. I think you start off that chapter with a quote from Mark Zuckerberg where he says that Facebook is more like a government than a company. And when I was reading this chapter, the one thing that stayed on my mind constantly was how, there is a conflict between these two parties. And I think one of the primary reasons of that conflict is, competition and antitrust. And how, governments, for the sake of the end customer, must always, ensure that big tech doesn't become too big, and that, the markets they're governing are always, competitive rather than a monopoly or an oligopoly. uh, so keeping that in mind, as well as, recapping the chapter of that book, what do you think is the future of this conflict between government and big tech?
Yeah. No, so I think that this goes back exactly to what we just discussed, that you want to be able to play on an equal footing, right?
Right.
And for that, you have to set some rules of the game, right? Before you set the rules of the game, you have to understand the game, right? Which is why I first lay out what the game is actually looking like on the economic side, on the geopolitical side, on the military side. Before I say, actually, now let's talk about setting the rules of this game. And the rules of the game have to be set at two levels, as I say in that section, right? Gautam, one is at the global level, and the
Right.
second is at the national level. At the national level, there's a battle going on between governments and big tech in many countries of the world today. India, Australia, UK, Russia, China, all of Europe, America, right? And pretty much most nations of the world are facing this conflict because big tech firms are becoming so powerful, so influential, so rich, so technologically capable that today they understand society and the economy better in many ways than
Right.
governments do.
Right. Right.
See, historically, governments were uh, the gatekeepers of data about the country, data about the society, data about citizens, data about economic activity, etc. Right? You could argue that RBI knew more about finance flows in the country than a given bank.
Right.
Right? RBI had that macro view, and individual banks had the micro view of what was going on in the economy, let's say. Or an individual corporate had that micro view, but the finance ministry or the consumer affairs ministry had the macro view.
Understood.
Now that's no longer the case, right? Now, in many ways, some of the big tech firms, e-commerce firms, fintech firms, search platforms, social media firms, some of these conglomerates that cover many of these domains actually potentially have a much better, deeper, more accurate, more real time view of society and the economy than governments do,
Right.
right?
Right.
And that's an example to show how big tech firms are actually challenging the authority, the legitimacy, the role of governments in our nations. Right? And to me, that's at the core of the battle. The battle is about who should be running certain functions of the state. The state has been very clear in most countries that we are not in the business of doing business.
Right.
As long as you're doing business, there's no problem typically the state has. The state will benefit from the taxes and from the economic activity and jobs that a business will generate. The problem comes when the private firms start to step onto the shoes of governments. So
Right.
cryptocurrency, for example, the state pushes back against cryptocurrency because currency is a key, what I call a key sovereign function that was always the domain of the state,
Right.
at least in the last 100 years. You
Right.
go back a little bit more in history, Gautam, you realize that that was not always the case. There were multiple currencies typically in existence at a given time if you go back into history. But the last 150 years, the state has managed to get control of currency as a sovereign exclusive function. And
Right.
today it doesn't want big tech or cryptocurrency platforms to take away that exclusive control. Right? So this battle is playing out in so many different ways that, when you ask me what is the future of this conflict, I'll say two, three things. One is this conflict is in stage 1 or 2, let's say today. This is a multi-stage conflict. Right? The first stage was the big tech firms started to show that they had become powerful, governments realized it. Second step, which was the last year or so, across the world, governments have pushed back, either in the form of antitrust regulation, fines, right? You have so many instances now in Europe of European Union fining Google, fining Facebook, etc., for monopolistic activities uh, or tracking too much data that they didn't have to otherwise, etc. Right? That's the state pushing back. India, we've seen that also, by the way. Australia's seen that. The US is seeing it. And so I think stage two, almost the governments have been winning in a way. They've been putting big tech firms sort of back into their commercial domain. But this is a multi-stage game. The big tech firms are very smart. They have a lot at stake. Billions and billions are at stake, if not trillions now. And so they'll find ways to compete strategically still. They the recent signs are that stage three will potentially be a slightly more synergistic existence where big tech firms will say, here, we'll help you on XYZ things. In Ukraine, for example, big tech firms in a way helped. US big tech firms came to the help of the US government and other European governments and said, here, we will help you in the cyber defense of Ukraine. Right? Microsoft had a big security team that was helping cyber defense activities in Ukraine, for example. Right? Apple said we'll withdraw from these markets, right, in Russia, etc. So big tech firms and the governments are now at a stage where they are, I think, more cooperating than fighting. Right? This is my view. But I think conflict will arise again, right? Because now governments will try and push back too much, and then that's why I call it a tug of war, because I believe that this will continue a little bit, right, over multiple stages. The other point I'll make about the future of this conflict is, from a citizen standpoint, from a societal standpoint, it's very important that this competition continues between big tech firms. From the standpoint of individual citizens and a society, actually, it's very important that these two large entities, right? Now, from a citizen standpoint, these are two large entities that both, in a way, control and shape our lives, governments as well as big tech firms.
Right.
If they come together too much and get too aligned, then, we'll have a backlash from a citizen, sort of bottoms-up citizen and societal standpoint. They'll say, no, you're monitoring us too much, you're controlling XYZ too much, etc. Right? So there'll again be a backlash now, this time from a citizen standpoint. So almost it's a triangle, right? And you kind of want a balance to be maintained between governments, big tech firms, and citizens, or society, as I call it.
Right.
If two of these get together too closely, my worry is that, then you are in a position where it's almost like the British Crown and the East India Company aligning to dominate India, and India doesn't stand a chance as a society at that point. Then, similarly, today, if big tech firms and the US government were to get together, it would make things very difficult for citizens and society to maintain their individual liberties, their fundamental rights in a transparent way.
Right.
And so, in my hope is that some kind of healthy tension and conflict remains between these firms, not unhealthy, right, of course, but healthy competition should be there, so that this tug of war should continue in a way, so that the balance is maintained.
Definitely. That makes sense. While you were, answering my question, I was actually at the back of my head, one thing was playing is that how these themes that are currently playing in big tech and what we expect to, see happen in the future for big tech have actually played in the recent history itself. When we look at the oil industry, for example, that, how say, for example, a company like ExxonMobil was I think became too big, like how a nation state would describe it as too big, and how ExxonMobil, some even speculate is responsible for a lot of geopolitical events taking place throughout the world, whether it was I think there is a book called Private Empire, which delves into this much deeper, but and not just that, but how countries utilized oil as not only as a resource, but as a as a point of contention between each other. And I think that oil has, for example, played into a lot of geopolitical events, and private players in oil. We look at Standard Oil and how Standard Oil became too big in the US, and then eventually there was, I think, the first case of first case of competition law taking place in, and say the first big company, big oil company breaking up into smaller parts, and those themes are like very prominent in the oil space in general, like you rightly mentioned.
There's lots of parallels in the past, right? I mean, one of the things I've tried to do in the book, Gautam, is to show that history is repeating itself.
Definitely.
None of what we are, let me say not none, but very little of what we are going through today is new. Right? This has happened before. You rightly say it has happened in the case of oil, telecom, etc. But even more importantly, it has happened, as I've mentioned a couple of times, in the case of the colonial era as well. And you can also look into history to learn so many more lessons that today we sometimes miss if we don't have the historical linkages being created in our public discourse. I talk, you might have read this section, I talk about how the telegraph, which is in many ways the precursor to the internet, right? We went from the telegraph to the telephone to the internet in many ways. The telegraph was leveraged geopolitically and economically by the British, who were the dominant player in the telegraph industry, right? At their peak during Pax Britannica again, over a century and a half ago, they used their dominance of the telegraph infrastructure globally, right? They were the ones, they had, I think, a major, like, I don't know the exact numbers right now, but I think 80% of the telegraph industry was controlled by British firms, I believe. Might be a different number, but big chunk. And when the war broke out between the UK and Germany, World War I and World War II, on both occasions, the British, whose firms were the ones who could repair these underwater telegraph cables, one of the first things they did was cut off telegraph cable access for Germany, right? In parts that they could, to herd their communications with other parts of the world, right? So, and so I draw these parallels that that has happened before. Telegraph cables have been cut before when it came to war, right? And so today we again have a massive, while the internet is sometimes seen as a virtual thing, ultimately it's driven by these undersea cables that have been laid globally that very well actually very almost point to point map exactly the telegraph cable map. I have a map in the book also about this that shows the telegraph and the internet cables of today. And one of the first sections, chapters in my geopolitics section talks about this, that the security of that internet infrastructure is key. We're not talking about it enough. It has happened before that internet infrastructure or the telegraph infrastructure was weaponized in some ways or geopoliticized in some ways when it came to battle and conflict, and it can happen again. Right? And countries like India and others who are not major players in the repair industry of undersea cables or in setting up of these cables must have a plan in place. If tomorrow conflict breaks out, it might not just be on the physical borders of India. It could be threatening your digital borders in a way, what I call digital borders. And then you have to be prepared for that because it could very well happen. By the way, it's already happening now. There's a lot of conversation and worries in the US and in Europe that other countries, adversarial nations, could cut off internet cables that link these countries, right? Even the powerful countries. So this is a very real threat, but history can help us learn these lessons, right? And so we must look to history, understand whether it's the case of Standard Oil, telecom, etc., or how tech becomes geopoliticized when it comes to conflict. During the peacetime, it's all hunky-dory, but plays out very differently.
Definitely. Anirudh, before I move to my next question, I just want to take a minute to actually, just compliment this book because, I personally am a big, history nut. I love reading about geopolitics. I love reading about the global economy. I love reading about technology. I work in the startup space myself. And this book just lies perfectly at the intersection of all of these, topics. And it's just a fascinating book to, go through. And I personally recommend the Great Tech Game to anyone who is, interested in any one of these themes and, just to understand how the world has shaped up over the past, couple of centuries, in fact, and, what we can expect from the future itself. Where can we see society going towards? So, just a big kudos on this.
It's very kind of you, but yeah, that's one of my goals is to make sure that we all don't end up just siloed, right? You and I might work in the startup world, and it's very easy to get siloed into our day-to-day jobs and forget or lose sight of the big picture of how we are the tech sector or the tech startup ecosystem in particular also must understand these interlinkages, because ultimately all of these pieces, as you rightly said, these linkages end up shaping how our future will pan out. So I think I'm glad you also have an interest in the intersection of these things, because that's really my goal, that more of us keep thinking about these interlinkages and keep that in mind.
Definitely. I think this book, pushes you to not think at a micro level but start thinking at a macro level, because I think if anybody who is working in the tech space, they think at the most micro level, or at max they'll only singularly look towards their individual company's growth. But one must start thinking from an industry perspective, from a nation perspective, or even perhaps see how things link to the global story in general. And I think this book does a wonderful job in pushing you towards that. Yeah. So something very
Thanks.
interesting happened in parallel to the launch of your book. I think your books launch is arguably the first book with a limited edition NFT collectible card collection coming along with it. And so let's talk about cryptocurrency, which we briefly touched upon before. Let's talk about cryptocurrency, blockchain, and the metaverse and the Web3 space in general. Okay, and with decentralization at the core of Web3, and Web3 being a prominent technology frontier that can cause a paradigm shift, like you talk about how it steps on the government stores as well. What role do you see of nation states playing into this space, as well as of big tech companies? And with the context of India, do you think the latest tax rules are a step in the wrong direction, as they treat this space in a similar fashion of gambling, or are they the right step forward?
Sure. So see, from a government standpoint, there are two at least sets of lens that I think that any government should be looking at it from. One is, as we talked a lot, which is that Web3 technologies are in a way, and their emphasis towards decentralization is taking the initial idea of the internet forward. Right? The internet itself, the founding of the internet, if you've read or heard the story of why the internet came about and what the goals of the people who were working on the internet back in the day, a few decades ago, was to actually make sure that power doesn't get centralized, information flows do not get centralized, right? That there should be a decentralized network like the internet
Right.
that is
Right.
not controlled by a single power or a small set of firms. That was really one of the reasons, and I talk about this in the book, one of the reasons for the setting up of the internet in some ways, or at least how it was envisioned by its founders.
Right.
The last decade is not how it's played out. The last decade has seen counterintuitively that even though the internet was supposed to be a decentralizing force in terms of
Right.
power and information, the control of it has gotten centralized. Infrastructure remains decentralized, but the control of the internet has gotten centralized into a set of few firms and certain nation states who are trying to control the internet of their nations, right? There are countries that are trying to build their own national internets as opposed to a global interoperable internet. And so from the government standpoint, I think one of the views or on the lens is still that Web 3.0 is yet another attempt to further decentralize. In a way, it's good because it's trying to decentralize power away from the big tech firms. So you're seeing new leaders emerge in the crypto and Web3 space that are not necessarily the Google and Facebooks of the world, right? So in a
Right.
way, interestingly, as I mentioned in the book a little bit, technology itself is ensuring that tech and control of tech doesn't become centralized, right? So even though governments through their regulation and antitrust and all of that are trying to limit the power and strength of the big tech firms, interestingly enough, tech itself might have an answer to this, right? That could work
Right.
actually more effectively than antitrust regulation,
Right.
right? Whether or not the US government is able to limit the power of Facebook or Meta or other, we don't know how that will pan out. But I do think that Web3, blockchain, crypto, a lot of these developments in the Web3 world might actually create new winners who are not affiliated with, let's say, Meta or Alphabet and other. And so that's one thing for the governments to keep in mind, that this is a larger decentralization move in a historical context. The second piece that I think India is maybe not thinking about as much, but we should, is that this is yet another opportunity to win. Right, in the Web 1.0 and Web 2.0 worlds, right, we were still relatively behind, I would say, the US and some other countries when it came to setting up the foundational layers of that world or that architecture of that world. Right, Web 1.0, Web 2.0, all the infrastructure, architecture layers, the operating systems of that time, Android, Apple, the browsers, right? All the underlying architecture or the underlying equipment was built and developed by companies in the West, right? And India did not have a role. However, I think this time around, we are now at a point where we have the capital, access to capital, we have the entrepreneurs with the experience, we have a massive tech VC and startup ecosystem in place now. And so we have a lot of the fundamentals in place to actually now be one of the early winners in the Web 3.0 space.
Right.
And I think that's a very important perspective to keep in mind. And that now links to the question you asked about the crypto tax. Right. So now you have to have an eye on the big picture and not focus on necessarily or become over focused on micro policy decisions. To me, the crypto tax, whether it's at 30% or 20% or 40% or 10%, in a way is a micro policy decision. I think the macro policy decision that's needed in this country, in India, and not just from a private sector or from a public sector standpoint, but actually, I would say both private and public, and I would say the non-profit sector that works on, let's say, the policy issues around tech. We must, as a nation, say, here's another opportunity, by the way, for us to win and win big as a nation. Because unless we win big as a nation economically, we're not going to become a political power. We're not going to become a geopolitical power. We're not going to become a major power in the world unless we have won economically. China is a clear example of that.
Right.
They 30 years of massive economic development. Now they're at a point where, whether or not that's the right decision, that's a separate matter, that they engage in geopolitical conflict. But economic power has to precede everything else. And to me, Web 3.0 is a massive economic opportunity for the Indian nation, for the Indian tech startup ecosystem, for the Indian VC world, right? Where we can now build companies, hopefully, that are not always burning money.
Right.
I've talked about this a lot in recent days that, you combine all our unicorns and the cash balances that they have or the profits that they have, the grand addition of all of that, the grand sum of all of them will not equal, I think, even one of the large US big tech firms' profits, right?
Right.
That's what counts, right? We were the shining jewel in the crown of the British also, right? But that didn't mean that we became rich or we became powerful or we became, or our entire nation developed, right? Our entire billion people or million people at that time did well. No, right? So today we are still a consumer market in many ways, and we need to move away from being that talent nation and a large internet market to becoming a key player. And I think Web3 is probably an amazing opportunity for us to be a key sort of player in that architecture layer, the infrastructure layer, and build the core. And companies like Polygon, etc., I find very sources of optimism because they are actually building some of the foundational layers today. And so if we have that, more of that, enable more of that, policy should be enabling all of this. Right. While maintaining your sovereign functions, I don't think that India as a nation will give up its sovereign control of currency or national security or foreign policy, and I think that's fair. But I think from an economic standpoint, we must put in enabling policy for India to win big in Web3 and climate tech, for example. By the way, I argue in the book in the last section that climate tech is an equally big, if not bigger, opportunity than the internet was over the last 2 decades, and we must not challenge or as a threat, right? I mean, I think sometimes our instinct in India is to see any new technology as a threat.
Right.
You must not, must see it as an opportunity and then say, oh, how do we manage the risks associated with it? Let's see it as an opportunity. I think a great job of that, whether out of a strategy or otherwise, but they look at things as an opportunity and then manage risks. We look at things like a risk with opportunity. I think we need to flip our perspective on that.
That is I think a wonderful summary of what you just mentioned, and just wanted to give you just an FYI that we actually had we here at the Indianaut podcast actually had an opportunity to speak to Jayanti Kanani, the CEO of Polygon, and we actually got his perspective on this too, which is available in our archive, and you can always you can give that a listen. I now want to that is great. Thank you for that. I would actually now like to ask you two questions, which actually, borrow from your experiences as a VC and as the co-founder of IIF, So the first question I want to ask you is, a question that directly, looks at your work as a VC to your work on the great tech game. So across all of your investments as a part of IIF, what instances at a startups level did you note that directly play into the themes that you talk about in your book? It could be a particular country showing interest in a particular startup product, or even the sudden impact of a fat tail geopolitical event on one of your invested companies growth. So I would love to see that you talk about that linkage between your work as a VC and the themes of your book.
Sure. Many examples actually, right? So you'll find that the flow of capital, right, as you rightly said, also I think alluded to, is often driven by geopolitical concerns. Right, the last 2-3 years have seen a massive boom in the startup ecosystem in India. Right, you've seen the creation of many unicorns. You've seen the creation of many companies that have raised much bigger rounds of capital today than they were probably likely to, let's say, 3 years ago even.
Right.
Right now there are two geopolitical reasons that are driving that. One is a lot of the capital that has flown in the Indian ecosystem was coming in from the US, Japan, of course, China also till a certain period. Now, but the big boom in the flow of capital into the startup ecosystem, many of our companies have benefited from this in our portfolio and otherwise. That the capital has stopped flowing. A lot of the capital from Europe and America, US, has stopped flowing as easily as it was to China.
Understood. Right.
And is now flowing to India, right? Um, and that's a clear geopolitical implication, right? We might think that suddenly the Indian startup ecosystem changed in the last 2 years, something happened, and now we have become better. We have become big. Well, maybe we have. I do think that the quality of entrepreneurs and quality of our VCs, etc., is increasing, right, every year, because we are growing, we are learning as a community, etc. That's true, but to me, the big reason, maybe unspoken about, but I think a lot of people realize this, has been because of the geopolitical developments. Right, that's one. Second, some startups have benefited specifically by the withdrawal of Chinese competitors, as I mentioned, right? And I have companies in our portfolio, without naming particular ones, that benefited from this because their competitors were now not in the market anymore.
Right.
So suddenly their market shares grew, their user bases grew, whether they were in gaming, whether they were in content, right? So many such examples exist where startups then benefited directly. Now, many also suffered, as we were saying earlier in our conversation, right? And that's why it's very important to have an eye on the geopolitical implications, because now we are a country that is being very much seen in the middle of these geopolitical calculations, right? We're no longer we're a very significant player now in geopolitical calculation. As a result, any startup founder must be thinking about geopolitical risk, geopolitical opportunity. That maybe wasn't the case 10 years ago. Maybe 10 years ago we didn't have to think like that, but today I think all entrepreneurs have to think like that.
Right. That is absolutely correct. Anirudh, I have one last question for you, and this is something we ask every guest on the podcast. Keeping your experience as a venture capitalist in mind, as well as your experience as the author of the Great Tech Game, what advice do you have for other aspiring Indianauts or entrepreneurs?
Well, read my book and tell me like how you guys liked it, or what your thoughts are. I'd love to from people who get the opportunity to read the book, and I'd love to engage more deeply with folks who have thoughts on any of the themes I've raised, because one of the goals for me is also to have this conversation started, right? And I think you're doing a great job with Indianaut to that extent that you are making these conversations happen on a broader set of topics than just who's raised what round and who's a unicorn now versus others. I think the conversation needs to be broader, and I hope that this sparks many more conversations, not just between me and you or me and others, but between folks, right? As we were just discussing. That's one. Second, I would say, as far as lessons or key takeaways for entrepreneurs is concerned, right? Or people who want to become entrepreneurs in the coming years, or even young professionals who might be listening, is that, to me, from a historical context standpoint, today we are standing at a point where we must be thinking about how this game will play out in the future, and how we can place ourselves as individuals, as families, as a nation, to win in this game, right? We must think big, one, and we must think towards the future.
Right.
I often say to people who ask me this, even in my extended family, etc., if people are starting up their career now, is that to me, think of almost an analogy I draw is that think of yourself in 1750, right, where the industrial era is just starting. You haven't actually seen how it'll play out for the next 200 to 50 years, right?
Right.
But today we have the hindsight benefit of that. Think of yourselves as if you were a professional in 1750.
Right.
What kind of companies, what kind of opportunities do you want to devote your lives to? Keep this context in mind that the next 100, 200 years are going to be shaped by technology, not just internet technology, but by climate technology, but biotechnology, AI, and these forms of technology. Don't see them as something that you don't understand or something that you fear, right? Even if you're not from a tech or engineering background, look at these technologies in the way that even if you understand them from a broader standpoint, you'll be able to place your skills, your interests in the larger scheme of the tech world, right? Everyone in the tech world is not a techie.
Right.
Everyone who benefited from the industrial era growth was not an industrial engineer, right? So we need as many people who are experts in other parts or other fields to be part of the tech world, right? So increasingly, I'll give you an example. The tech world about a decade ago didn't have any policy heads. There were no policy heads at companies, like Flipkart, etc. when they first started, right? 2007, even 2010, 12. It's a recent phenomenon, but where companies have realized that their influence, their work is now intersecting with so many pieces that now you need a lot more people who bring other expertise into the tech world, right? And so we'll see a diversification of the experts, whether it's marketing, consumer acquisition, psychology, philosophy, policy. So you can come at it from your vantage point as a professional, right? You don't have to become a tech founder straight away, right? Or tech startup founder, but find your role in this great tech game, and then think of your career like that for the next 30, 40, 50 years, right? So that'd be, I think, my broad lesson, or broad key takeaway, I think, for younger professionals today thinking about their careers from a starting standpoint. Like, think of it like that.
That is wonderful, Anirudh, and very aptly put. And thank you so much for joining us today, Anirudh. We wish you the very best for the future and hope to see many more books come out of that wonderful mind of yours.
No, thank you very much, Gautam. Very kind of you. And thank you for having me on your podcast. But also, great job on doing, I think, a podcast that, as I said earlier, covers a broad set of themes, issues broadly. I think that's a great service for the tech ecosystem as well.
Thank you so much for that. And once again, folks who are listening to this podcast, I highly recommend The Great Tech Game. This book is now available at multiple bookstores. I think all around the country. So do go and grab your copy today.
Great, thank you so much, Gautam.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for this episode. The Indianaut podcast is available on YouTube, Apple Music, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Be sure to follow us on Instagram and Facebook to receive all updates on the upcoming episodes. We'll see you in the next one.